Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. It's good to be back in studio again. You know, as I was looking over and pondering things, do you realize we've been doing this over 6 years?
Wow.
I think
6 years? Oh, my goodness. Seems like only yesterday.
maybe to some of us.
Is that what I'm supposed to say? Right?
Yeah, that's what you're supposed to say. So pleasant working with you, Charlie.
But it's been amazing because it has gone through chapters. I'll say this. What you started off doing is not exactly what you're doing today. It has evolved. It has gone into new chapters. It hasn't been 6 years of the same conversation.
Right, and especially after our 2-month break, and we're sort of tweaking where we're going because we're talking about, we're really getting into life purpose, life direction, life goals, and we've talked about that quite frequently, but this is sort of a different take on it that I'm interested in. We'll see at the end of a couple of months what our listeners are thinking about, and we'll find out. Now, today's going to be so cool. Our guest today, I can honestly say, Lindsay, this is true. Lindsay Davis is truly one of my very favorite people in the world. And you know what? We have never met.
You told me that. I can't believe it.
I know. What have we done, Lindsay? Maybe 4 shows together?
I think so.
3 or 4 shows. And we have we've logged dozens of hours of deep telephone conversation. Lindsay's in Colorado and I'm in Southern California. And as many of you already know, having heard Lindsay is such a delight and a brilliant one at that. That's why she is so high on my list. Now, professionally, Lindsay is a highly sought-after creative business and professional coach, educator, and classical concert musician. She is also, I didn't list it here, but I want to make sure I mention it. She's a performance coach. She is performed in orchestras and a number of different events, and she works with people in how to maximize their talent and their expression in the performance arts. And if you need a coach that does any of that kind of thing, Lindsay is the one. Lindsay is also, she calls herself, I like this, and this has to do with our show, she calls herself a converted perfectionist, which now focuses on a continual process of nurturing a fresh and innovative approach to life, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So with that, let's bring her on the air. Lindsay Davis, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Hey, Charlie, it's so good to be back with you, and I'm humbled and honored after that introduction, so thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, it's really meaningful. I so look forward to our chats. It's one of my favorite quarterly actions is talking with Lindsay Davis. So, Lindsay, you know what I want to start with? I'm kind of doing in this next half of my shows. I'm kind of starting right at the heart of the matter, and so let me tell you a little bit of a story. Back in my hippie days in the late 1960s, and I was in the early days of the hippies at UCLA and hitchhiking to Berkeley, and I was all a part of that. Do you know, we all preached. When I say all, truly, I think most all of us preached this sort of common quest, and that was we felt our ultimate goal in life was to find ourselves. Now, I could think about when I would tell people what I'm doing. I'm trying to find myself, and you could see, in the 1960s, you could see this somewhat befuddled, quizzical, and probably more comical response. What do you mean, can you find yourself? Look in a mirror. You know where you're at. You know what is. And yet in the 60s, we were dealing with the first transformation from a very sort of not quite autocratic, but predetermined style of living. And that was our history, and we're saying this does not fit me. And I think although finding yourself almost sounds like gobbledygook, I find, we might argue that many of us are still in this process of finding our authentic selves today. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had to chuckle. Oh, I wasn't around in the OG hippie times in the 60s, but that idea of finding yourself, I wanted to ask similarly, where did you go? Where did you go? But
Yeah.
I do find that now we look at, I think a few years back or a few generations back, that it became millennials wanting to do things that were meaningful. We also see this quest in the younger generations now, because now millennials are middle-aged. But I do think it's just innate in humans to have a sense of purpose, to derive a sense of meaning, to have a point to why we're here.
I agree. And you know what I think we're facing today? I think all of those accepted standards of a state of who you are and what is your purpose and your meaning in life, the very foundations of what we once based those on, which would have been some sort of God and religion, some sort of governmental authoritative state, those are all up in the air. I read a quote are you familiar with the futurist Bob Johansen? I'm not my wife.
Have the most interesting people. Yeah.
What's that?
You always know the most interesting people to reference. I'm not familiar.
Oh, my wife turned me on to him, and he has a quote that he says, today many people call what we're experiencing in our culture today and our value system in our culture today is the Great Resignation, or more like the Great Reset. What we once believed were authoritative and meaningful and gave us ideas of who we are, we no longer hold up in value. We can't, you think about it, I wrote in my blog last week that it was politics, religion, and media. Politics, seems to be very self-centered. Among there are genuine people in our government people that genuinely want to help the culture, but you got other people that are individually oriented and promoting their own agendas. And then when you get to media, I look at media now, when I look at both Fox and CNN, I call them sycophants and evangelists. They are so into one side, and they're trying to preach their side and convert us. So we've got we've got competing Jerry Falwells trying to evangelize our hearts and our souls to their way of thinking. And then when it comes to God, so many people are millennials, Gen Ys, and not just that population, but that find religion repressive, irrelevant, and at times even preposterous. So here we are in this, what Johansen called the Great Resignation, resigning from what we once trusted, or to the Great Reset, resetting. But he says, I think the better title is the Great Reimagining. And Lindsay, I think we live in a day like that. I think this century, this epoch, this time in world, in human history is a bit unique. I think there's something much more significant about our changes and our goals than there have been in the past. Do you think that, or do you think I'm overplaying it?
No, I think what you have is your finger on the pulse of probably a larger cycle of humanity, and a couple things come to mind. I'm off the cuff, but I do believe that we crossed a threshold, the age of Leo into the age of Aquarius. So there's my upper hippie street cred. But the age of Aquarius being...
Tell me the age of Leo first. What are we crossing from?
Yeah, so, and I could be wrong on that one. I am sure on the age of Aquarius, but in Leo, it's much more bureaucratic or organized structure, I think we could reference the age of industry, the information age. I think we've now crossed into the age of imagination and innovation. Actually requires an unbraiding of known structure, because as the maestro Picasso said, every act of creation is first an act of destruction. One thing that we tend to not do very well as a human species is change. And so even though change is the constant in creation and evolution or reimagining, we resist it. And so what we're starting to see is those kind of, as you said, sycophants or evangelists towards holding the old structure. Underneath of that, I do believe, is fear of losing control. And then you have those who are embracing evolution, but maybe some are embracing evolution from a place of reimagining, and then maybe some are embracing evolution as a place of revolution or anger and rage. I think we're starting to see that fabric of known structures being unbraided. And then now it's asking us all to consider. If no one is telling you the structure of meaning, then how can you bring back agency and choose meaning for yourself? And can we actually do that all together collectively or not? And I think these are bigger questions that we're being asked to answer.
That's just, I'm thinking, I was thinking as you're talking, I was thinking about Maslow's chart, and somewhere either the bottom level or the second level is, food, clothing, but safety, protection, safety, and we are fearful, and we want safety, we want consistent, we want the known. I'm fond of saying when it comes to change that so frequently a bad known is preferable to any unknown, because the unknown could be worse than the bad known rather than it could be an advancement. And I think what I'm finding is that in the rejection, there are those, the youth, because the youth don't have as much fear of change because they're not quite so settled. They're a little bit more nimble, hopefully. They can embrace. I remember when I was young, I wanted to embrace change. I wanted to see change. And, I had an idea of what I might want that change to look like, but not very specifically. So what we're going to talk about is I want to make the purpose of today's show an investigation of a French phrase that's used quite a bit, but not defined really clearly, and that's it's called in French, and I don't speak French, but I can say this one little phrase, raison d'être. And it is translated literally in French, a reason for being. And I think, Lindsay, it occurs to me in the United States, with more free time, less time having to be devoted to pure survival, putting food on the table, clothes, shelter, and more, that there's a more discretionary time. With more discretionary time comes the opportunity to evaluate a raison d'etre, to evaluate our reason for being. And does that ring a bell with you at all?
Mm-hmm. Definitely the raison d'etre. That's the first time I've ever said that word. I was going to say in French.
Yeah, it's a good French.
But also do think that we have the opportunity to have a reason for being, even in times of great suffering. So although we definitely see it in the Maslow model, almost we have it as privilege that our food and shelter and basic needs are met. We have that opportunity anytime. In the book Man's Search of Meaning,
Frankl.
I think of Viktor Frankl, who found or chose reason for being even in a time of great suffering. So I do think this is a conversation that anyone in any realm of life right now can ask themselves, what is my raison d'etre? What is my reason for being?
Yeah. Yeah, and probably one of the most one of the strongest books that talk about suffering is in fact the Bible. I mean, it is, and you talk about the suffering Christ. It was a life of rejection, a life of no renown, deep suffering relationally, and how the upper classes rejected him, and so it was a constant life of rejection and suffering, but also a number of accolades. But the final element, the cross itself, was about suffering, and the Scripture is filled with the benefits from suffering. And then now we find that most everyone will agree that our greatest learnings come from our greatest failures, mistakes, issues. That's where we learn from. It is from our suffering and difficulties.
That's a beautiful example of someone, meaning Christ, who had a reason, a commitment, something he was devoted to living out that went beyond just him immediately. We might call it a greater why.
Yeah, greater why.
And it, and it went. Then he was able to live into his suffering from a place of, I believe, like peace and almost honoring that it's a worthy sacrifice. It's a worthy sacrifice, and I don't know that that's a phrase that we talk about a lot in our current culture. But it seems to be related to having that greater purpose or driving principle or devotion, something that you're devoted to that goes beyond your immediate personality or your immediate circumstances.
Yeah, it's longer term. I like that, but I also this is it brings up in my mind a very powerful tension, and that is we can tend to, in looking for a reason for being, we can tend to get very personal, very self-centered, very it's all about me and what's going on with me, which is very human. That is the human. But it is commonly rejected that if I'm only thinking of myself, I'm not thinking of the world, I'm not thinking of other people, I'm not thinking of how I can help. But there is another side to that, Lindsay, and that, I believe that you are the master of your life. I believe, as Pam and I were talking, you are, at the end of the day, you are the hero of your life because of the kinds of choices you make. So there is a sense in which you are legitimately, indeed, the center of your life, in that you make the choices that apprehend or understand other elements of life. So it is all about me, but the all about me has to be turned into the me that deals with society as a giving, sacrificial person. Was that all gobbledygook, or did that make sense? Paul's rolling his eyes at me.
He's allowed to. I do think the created self or the chosen self, that master creator of your life or your experience, is true. Isn't meaning that you can control every little thing about your life, but you can control your response and the narrative, the story that you create from it. I also think there's another layer to this, and I think I'll hat tip, I think originally Steve Chandler for teaching me this. Mm-hmm. I think it also came from the work of Jim Dethmer. But like these stages or portals that a human can actualize through, and the first one being that life is happening to me. And this really has a feeling of being a passive recipient to whatever life is handing you.
So
And
what's the alternative? I
happen.
like that. I mean, I like that one. Not that I like it, but I like the articulation of it. So what's the alternative?
Then you have the active participant where I am the creator of my life. So life is happening by me. And then I think you have one beyond it, and you think you'll appreciate this as a mystic, which life is happening through me, meaning that I'm a co-participant. I'm bringing my desire, my purpose or reason. I'm also tuning into a greater or divine desire that wishes to be expressed through me, but also through everyone. So life happening to me, life happening by me, and then if it's also life happening through me.
And I view that as all of those three, each of those three alternatives are a choice. That I choose, am I going to be sort of at the whim of destiny or some sort of predetermined that I just have to act accordingly, or you gave three choices, but I got two, or I can choose to be involved in it. I can choose to embrace it and let it work through me. It's like Viktor Frankl in the concentration camps. It's that he could not control the environment, but he can control how he thinks of and manages the environment, how he copes with that environment. And that is, then the environment is working through you.
Yeah, and to use a playful, non-sacred illustration, it's sort of like, you get the cards you're dealt, but you're also a participant in how you play the hand.
Oh, I'm a big cards you are dealt and how you play the hands guy. I use that metaphor a lot. I love that. So tell me, Lindsay, with you are a very purposeful, very direction-oriented. You can float with the energy, float with what's going on, and yet in the midst of your floating, you're floating in a spaceship that you can guide wherever you want to guide it. And I'm curious, in your guiding spaceship, what kinds of things do you do to discover your raison d'etre?
Question. I haven't thought of it as a spaceship, but I like it.
I do. I know. I just thought of it that way, so it's just my brain wandering.
Yeah. And it is, you said this at the start, it is more directional for me. So it is what is moving me or what I'm moving towards. It might be feeling that I want created more in my life, and not a passing emotion, more of a feeling of aliveness. So it's this directional way, and then it guides my choices. And I think one piece, I know we discussed this when we've talked before, but it's an understanding fundamentally of who I am and who I'm not, and not over-attaching to different personality labels, realizing I'm all of those labels and none of them. And so I'm the one who chooses. So I can have a overall direction. I can choose what is purposeful for me today. Is my reason for being today? Is my reason for being, or theme almost, that I want to live into for the year or for this next chapter in my life. And so that's, I think, the underlying, how I view myself and how I choose, and then becomes a choice filter throughout. So, for example, one of mine that I'm living into more and more these days is what it means to live with courage. I don't know that I'll keep that for the rest of my life, but that's an important reason or value, a higher value.
Tell me about that. What does it mean to live with courage? And I know you're married to a special ops man, was in special ops, so their purpose, they have a very clear purpose, but we don't have perhaps as clear as objectives as a mission for a special ops. What kind of objectives would you say that you're looking for?
Courage?
In courage, yeah, with courage.
I think it's a commitment to hunting out, and I'll use that term intentionally, like a cat, or an animal, where I'm hunting out areas where I'm taking a disempowered stance. I don't think I can. I don't have time. I don't know that it's possible. Like those kind of humdrum statements that drain me, actually. And to look at, all right, is that actually true? And to say, what am I actually afraid of? And how can I press that edge a bit or test it and see what happens so that I don't get too rigid in a really controlled, safe box of this is who I am and this is what I'm capable of, and I don't want to change because I'm scared of losing everything. To actually, to me, a value of courage is simply one of choosing what's alive, choosing heart, choosing to grow. And it doesn't necessarily look bold and loud and crazy. I'm not an adrenaline junkie in any way. And so it's just these little choices of, am I going to listen to the voice of fear today? And what I can't do, what I'm scared of is going to happen? Or am I going to listen to that quieter, intuitive whisper that says, well, what if you can? Or I wonder what's on the other side of that discovery.
You're speaking of a concept that occurs to me, and I don't know if it's you can embrace it, or if it agrees with what you're saying, but it's more of this approach of mystery, that life is a mystery. It is not predictable. It is not controllable. And yet we manage that process. We dance with that process. We dance in mystery and in heart, not so much in head. This morning I was I had a couple of errands, and I was listening to a podcast by one of my go-to shows. I'm a fan of Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss is he used to be very detail-oriented, follow this process, follow these steps, do these sort of things. He has grown where he's really much more open. He's questioning, he's asking questions, and he was talking with a really famous author today, and I'm a bit reluctant, but I might as well say it's the guy who wrote Essentialism. I can't remember his first name, but he's written a book on what would make 2024 a great year. There's a whole document, which I've written a document, but he reads 3 to 5 pages every Sunday to remind himself of who he is and what he wants to do. And then every week he has 3 activities that are level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 is everything that's essential. Number 2 is essential and urgent. And the number 3 is just your day-to-day tasks. That sounds like science fiction to me. It's just, I can't live that way. I don't want to say these are my 3 things that I have to do this week, because I don't know. I have an idea. I want room to experience. I want room to grow. I want room to adapt and evolve.
Well, I'm with you. I'm on Team Charlie here. I actually have had years, probably you have too, of trying to figure out, well, what's the right way or the best way to do this.
Oh, Lindsay, I've got anal charts. I have anal charts that I followed.
Yes. I think there is something to having a structured process for people who are needing to build more grit or follow through or resilience. I don't necessarily need a strong dose of that. I already have that in my experience. And so what, probably similarly to you, I really trust myself deeply. The question of what's actually most alive for me today. What's important. What I mean by important is not necessarily the head, but the heart, the in the body, what is really, that is the question, what is most alive for me?
That is beautiful. And if you can do it, that means you have to disregard the voices of your childhood and of all, so much of your development model that you were taught that you have to control. I mean, you were raised, I know, in a conservative tradition. You are a concert violinist. There's a little bit of, you got to follow the structure. There's no way that you're going to make it without following a structure. That's why you called yourself a recovering perfectionist or something like that. You had to develop a sense of moving outside of that box. How did you get, so many of us are caught up in that kind of box. How did you get out of that, Lindsay?
I think rather than get out of the box, it's like an absorbing the box where you can always have more structure. Like you can put that in any time. And there are seasons creatively where I might choose more structure for myself. I might have daily practice that I'm doing. It might be, whether that's in the body, in the mind, in my business, but don't need to hang on to it. And so you kind of absorb the structure box, but then you go beyond it. Then you trust yourself with more fluidity or more unknowing. I do think that's a deep question for people. Can I live with what really energizes me and still be accomplished, still create what I want, still, or am I going to be on a beach with nothing? Or I guess, I don't know if that would be terrible, but I'm trying to think of a bad example, but I think you know what I'm saying. Like,
yeah.
Can it really happen? Can I really trust myself? What have you found? Because you live in a more fluid discovery too in your chapter of life.
Because I found out the other didn't work. And I would, I'm my personality type is one of those ones who will make lists and then lose them. And I believe what I used to define as deadlines, I now call guidelines, is sort of a direction. And that's kind of where I want to go. I want to take a break. And I want to go in the next half, and that is what you and I talked about our direction, our direction for our reason for being. And our reason for being can be also translated into a way of being, lifestyle. And it's a lifestyle of direction over destination. We are very destination-oriented people, and I'm suggesting we need to be more directionally oriented. So let's take a break, and we'll come back to that subject. Hi, everyone. This is Charlie Hedges, and you are listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie. And our, really special guest today is an extraordinarily bright, creative, and industrious person, Lindsay Davis. Lindsay, we were talking about pursuing the kind of life that gives us an excellent, or gives us a strong foundation, a strong bearing, that is a direction rather than a destination. And let me tell you a story. In the mid-90s, I was doing a job in Canada and flying back from Canada, and I happened to sit next to an executive. I don't know if he was VP or board member, but he was a high-ranking executive with Charles Schwab. And we started chatting, and I was saying, well, what are you doing? He was coming from New York City. And he said, we were just with a group, with our sort of innovative group, and we were talking about how we can make trading of investments online. Now, in the mid-90s, there was no such thing. There was not even talk about doing trades online. And it was, I was just totally intrigued. And I asked him, I don't recall his name, I asked him, so what does it look like? What are you going to do? And he says, we don't really know what it looks like. We know There's a process involved in a direction. And the way we articulate it is that we're in New York and we're headed west. We know we're headed west. We're not headed any other direction. This is our direction. So we kind of picked a direction, and their direction would have been online investment. But what that looks like, they didn't know. And he says, so we're headed west. We don't know if we're going to land in St. Louis or San Diego or Salt Lake City. Oh, all S's. And you know, Lindsay, that stuck with me. That has stuck with me. I heard that 30 years ago, I guess, and it is still stuck with me that I like the idea of heading west. As a matter of fact, I have a potential title for our show today is Heading West, Reimagining Your Future. Now, I will see if that turns out to be the title, but tell me, you and I had interesting discussions on heading west and destination as not being as good of an objective as direction. Tell me your thoughts on that.
I love this. I love that phrase. Since you shared it, it's going to haunt me in the best ways. Heading west. I can relate because in my family's lineage, they were actual settlers, pioneers of Colorado, and so that idea where I'm sure there were people in their hometowns or home country before they came here where they said, you don't know what you're doing. What are you doing? And they said, I don't know. We're just going here. And I think that is the lived experience of anyone who is trailblazing or creating change. Here's the flaw of the destination. Somebody had to have been there before. But what if what you're creating hasn't really existed? These are typically my clients. Or the way that you're wanting to do something hasn't really been done, at least the way that you're doing it. Well, then you don't know the destination. That doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing. It just means that you're breaking new trail. And breaking new trail for hopefully people to come behind you and have a smoother, clearer experience. It does take those people who are willing to say, I don't need a destination. I'm going to head west. But what they do know is they know themselves. They know right now for this particular journey what they stand for, what's important to them, they're not willing to do or not going to do. And then they know that they can trust themselves to flex or adapt or even know when to stay steady on the terrain changes. It's almost like writing a map back in the day, like Lewis and Clark.
Yeah. Well, like Chris Columbus, Marco Polo. Chris Columbus thought he was going somewhere, but he really was going a direction, and he had a vague goal of reaching Asia without knowing that there's a pretty big landmass in between. And look what he discovered, and because he adapted, he had to adapt. And it turned out to miraculous, and it was all directionally oriented. I think that's strong. Now, I was thinking, and these are my labels, so they're not sociologically researched, but this is what occurred to me. We have more than 3 types of people in the United States, but I'm going to put us into 3 categories. And it's categories.
I like being categorized.
What's that?
Like categories.
Oh, good. Let's hope these are helpful. But within each of these categories defines a technique for developing a reason for being. And I call it the people that are the driven people, the content people, and the curious people. Now, the content people are content with the status quo. They, at first I wanted to call them complacent, but they're really not complacent. They just are whatever's going on right now. They're happy. They don't need to think any more deeply about it. They don't need more of a reason for being. They've got their beliefs and where they are, and that represents a bunch of America. and those are not the ones that we're necessarily, I think we could rouse some curiosity in them, which is the final phase. But before we get to the curiosity, it's the driven people. And the driven people are these very small handful of people that know from an early age, they know what they want, and that's all they're going to do. They are driven to that. Once they get that, they stay in that. They're moving it. I can use, for an example, my son is a driven man. Now, he's driven in his vocation, but he's very open to different styles of life, different philosophies. So, he's not closed. But when it comes to what he's doing in life, he's a baseball player. He's going to stay in baseball. He can see himself, he's 31, he can see himself in baseball for the next 40 years. And that is driven. I think of my friend who started out in investment banking and, made a gob of money 2 years out of college, and that is all he does. And so today he's worth 50 or 70 million because he is driven. And then you have the content that are content with the status quo, but then the other group is the curious, just wondering. It is the what if people. What if I did this? What if I tried this? I'm wondering. I've always thought a certain way. What if I think a different way? It's this open-minded, searching, seeking, and I think that's our audience. And I don't know what they represent, the numbers they represent in the American population. Do you have any thoughts on my three made-up categories?
Well, I like it. Are you open to some fun spin? Can we play?
Play. Yes, let's go.
Okay. Yeah, these are fun. I think it's fun that you thought these up. Plus, trios or triads are multi-layered, whether we're talking spirituality or physics, geometry. Yeah. So triangle is amazing. But I'm also curious what the blend is. So can you be driven and curious? Is there a margin there? Or can you be content and driven? What does that look like? People, and so those shading, people on the cusp.
Yes. I
find that very interesting. But what's also fascinating, the fun spin when you were talking about this, is it seemed to mirror elements.
Mirror what, Lindsay?
Fire elements. The content maybe being very earthy.
Oh, okay.
Just stable, salt of the earth. Right?
Yeah.
And then you have the driven, which is very fiery and hot. And then you have the curious, which is very air-like or movement-oriented. But then I think you do have those blends of the two. And the other thing that was really interesting is how much these mirror Jungian archetypes or universal archetypes.
Yeah.
Because you have the warrior or the outlaw, kind of fiery. You have the caretaker or provider, the father or mother, the lover, this very grounded in here and now. And you have then the mystic or the poet or the explorer. These kind of archetypes, I think, are at play in these categories.
That's beautiful, because what that does, I like that more people can embrace these blends and these combinations than just one strict say, well, I'm like this, I'm like two of them. Well, of course you are. And I did Richard Rohr's archetypes, and he has 4 archetypes: the warrior, the romantic, the mystic, and the elder. And it requires to have pieces of each one in you, even though one would be stronger, one would hold sway over the others, but have pieces of each in that. And then I worked with another person on archetypes. I've done a little bit of self-evaluation work, and I ended up with 11 archetypes. Now, there's a couple that are stronger than the others, but they all fit me. And so let me close it with a story on my son, and that my son is driven in baseball, and he's but he's always modifying his approach. But it's all around being serving his baseball team the best way he can know, the best way he knows how to serve it. But when it comes to philosophy, you and my son understand me better than just about anybody. My son, it didn't go to college, but is as brilliant a philosopher as I've ever found. He can talk deeply, so he's always trying to structure meaning and purpose and direction in his life outside of baseball. What kind of person do I bring to the table? It's not just that I am at the table and I expect things from other people. Who am I? How do I add to the value of this? And so he is a combination of, in my three categories, a combination of the driven and the curious. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that you leave space for all of it, or these archetypes that you've brought to life, because I think you're right. Can have different chapters in our life where some are more alive for us or expressed in those particular chapters, and then we're allowed to make a change. We're allowed to trade. We're allowed to take off. It was you that introduced this metaphor. We're allowed to take off those layers, like a sweater, and choose a different one to live into that we would like to express more of, or that our current mission or context is asking for us to express more.
Yeah, and I think more than external, it's internal. I think that we're asking that question of ourselves. How can I be more, do more, impact more, receive more, whatever? It's just, we, even those that are sort of adverse to change, like certain change. But the unpacking, let's wrap up our show together with this unpacking, because I think this idea of unpacking, this just came to me last week in a group study that I was in, and an educator, I was in a small group of 4 people that we were discussing. It turns out we were discussing authenticity. And an educator talked about a sophomore in high school who was an immigrant that was adopted or under the care of a wealthy family, so was able to go to a wealthy school, but had a whole history of abuse and neglect and poverty. And so this young man's view of himself was not that great as a sophomore year. She said 2 years later, in working, he worked really hard at self-development and who he was. He had a much better understanding, and she was so bold as to say, as a senior in high school, she actually said he was authentic, and so the rest of us kind of rolled our eyes a little bit, thinking, how authentic can a high school person be? And yet, that high school person can be authentic for that stage of life. Can be authentic, can be less image oriented, more personal, sort of ontologically oriented. And that's when it occurred to me as I was talking to them. I said, it's like layers. It's like when I went to the Arctic Circle to see the Northern Lights, we dressed in layers, several layers, so we could be in zero weather for extended period of time. I said, what we need to do with this, what we not need to do, but what we do naturally is, as we're thinking about life, and we think at one point we sort of arrived and we're kind of there, we start peeling the layers of this artichoke, and it's freeing. You take off the heavy coat, it's you're a little more limber, you're freer, and you continue down. But we are peeling layers off this. I like the artichoke idea, because I understand that the artichoke is tastier the deeper you get, and that you finally get to a pulp in the center, where that's what you're trying to do, that's your ultimate goal. But we're peeling off layers of identity to get the truest identity that emerges, that we want to live to authentically. Long explanation.
Yeah, it's beautiful though. And thematically, or embodied, when we talk about authenticity, I feel like we make it so hard. in the culture. I want to be authentic. And it's just this really mental construct. But really in the body, authenticity is relaxation and presence. When you meet somebody who's relaxed and present, they tend to be authentic for that moment or for whatever layer of artichoke they're being.
Yeah. And we're so concerned about the self that we present. In so many of our circumstances, and I know I do it. I just went to a big, sort of gala opening of an event circle, and and I dressed a certain way because I wanted to present. I wanted to present me. Then I wanted to be the real me. But how much of that was the real me, and how much of that was the me I want others to understand and accept and honor, when it may not be the true, most real me. Lindsay Davis, we could go on for, I've got more notes, so we'll have to have a second time in a couple of months, and we'll do this again. But if I were to ask you, no, I won't. No, I'll just say if I were, and see if you care to respond. What kind of encouragement would you give to people who have heard this and saying, I want that core reason for being. I want a way of life that's consistent with who I am. What kind of encouragement might you offer them as a performance coach?
I would say start at the end. So maybe begin by asking yourself, what would be the end, like a eulogy goal? I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive for encouragement, but what would you hope that the essential qualities of your life, or what's important at the end? And then how can you start living into those today, in your context today? And bring those for now as a point of meaning, direction. Yeah, begin with the end in mind.
I'm writing because you just titled my blog for next week.
I look forward to reading it.
Okay, I'm writing. That's why I'm silent. Okay, unsilent. But I love a eulogy goal. Eulogy, legacy. What are the kinds of things? This guy that I heard today that I did agree with, that McEwen talked about, he says it's the 100x and the 1000x, value on activity. And he put families at the one, your marriage, we may not focus on it a lot, but if your marriage is screwed up, your whole life is screwed up. If you get one little thing wrong in your current daily task or your job responsibilities, your whole life is not impacted like a marriage being impacted. And so it's understanding those things that truly impact us most in a eulogy goal. And marriage is a big deal. Your relationship, so it's not just marriage, it's your relationship with other people, who you are closest with. Those are the kinds of things that go into eulogy goals, and it's a brilliant idea. I want to write on that. Thank you for. Do you mind if I write on that? Do I have permission to
I would
steal
love to
your title?
hear your thoughts.
Okay.
I would love to hear your thoughts. It's relationship. It might be even, to use those words like "don't die with your music inside of you." For some people, eulogy is the thing that they want to bring to life, and they're scared that it's going to fail. That would be their eulogy. It's almost like when you rest your head on the pillow, grand rest, what is just like that feeling of like, yeah, really lived.
Well, you've got, I open all my blogs with a quote. So I'm going to quote Lindsay Davis. Don't die with your music inside of you.
Google that quote, because I think it's not original to me.
I don't have to. I'm just going to make it you. No one will know. Okay. Because you probably use a few words they didn't use, so it's there's nothing new under the sun. Everything I say has been said by somebody else. So I don't worry too much. Lindsay Davis, you are absolutely just too cool. Thank you for agreeing to come on the show. And it was just recent. Terry was going to come on today. And then when we started talking about raison d'etre, I just said, oh, gosh, if Lindsay's available, that would be wonderful. And you were available. Thank you so much for your kindness.
Thank you. This was synchronistic, and it's always a pleasure, truly, to be connected with you and then to be featured on your show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lindsay. I will publish your contact information so people can get a hold of you. And I want to encourage everybody, and I don't do this for all the coaches. I get a handful of coaches. Folks, if you want a great coach, if you want a coach that understands you and is going to make a difference in your life, check out Lindsay. If she's got time, that's the critical thing. But if you can get her, you've got a winner.
Well, thank you.
Okay. So at this time, I'd like to thank all our listeners for tuning into the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.